I'd like to welcome you to Module 9 of the Natural Systems Agriculture course. My name is Martin Entz. I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba, and this is the last of the 9 modules in the certificate course for that we've been working on with you. So welcome wherever you're calling from, and let me get started right now. Um, So Module 9 is entitled People and Natural Systems Agriculture. And so just to remind us where we are, my name is, I gave you my name. I actually hold the Jarislowsky Chair in Natural Systems Agriculture for Climate Solutions at the University of Manitoba. And the university is located here in Treaty 1 territory right in the longitudinal center of Canada. So today we're going to talk about social ecological systems, a little bit theory, introduce you to that concept, talk about then some other themes uh, around how nature sustains people. An exciting theme actually on nature-based food production systems and how the nature-based ideas that we talk about affect food quality. How do we increase nature awareness, not just among farmers, but among future farmers? Talk about indigenous knowledge and then end off with, um, I'm calling it shifting agronomists thinking towards agroecology because agronomists are really important for advising farmers and conducting research. And we want to ensure that they are aware of all the opportunities of a more natural systems agriculture paradigm. So here's a great quote. There are no social systems without nature. So that's true. If we look outside the windows of where we're sitting, we are maybe in a city, maybe in a town, maybe in a village, maybe driving down the highway and or walking, and we're part of a social system, but nature is all around us. And there are indeed few ecosystems without people. So perhaps Antarctica and the Sahara Desert are examples. And what social ecological systems involve is the interaction between humans and their environment. And this image here on the right from People in Nature really shows that network of sort of ecosystems and agriculture really well for a smallholder farm. So we've got all kinds of ecosystem services coming from the natural areas around the farm, and they include, insects for pollination, biological pest control, water regulation, and nutrient cycling, maybe also temperature modification. And so we can see that there's definitely that um, interaction between the human activity of the farm and the surrounding environment. Now, the concept of socio-ecological systems has been gaining a lot of traction. And on the right here, we can see the number of publications related to socio-economic ecological systems over about 20 years. And the number of publications has really, really gone up. What some people see as the model for socio-ecological systems is that we've got human systems, ecosystems interacting with each other. They're together. Humans are not on top. They're completely embedded in each other. And if you would like to learn from a really skilled scholar in this area, Dr. Fikret Berkes, he's a professor emeritus at the University of Manitoba. In this YouTube video, he's explaining some of the work that they have done at the Stockholm Resilience Center. So uh, the lecture is about 35 or 40 minutes. It's maybe a touch dry, but I think it's really worth watching um, for you students. Okay, so I'm just going to have a sip of my tea, and then let's get into the outline of the lecture. So here are humans as depicted by the stick person. And here are the points that I want to focus on in today's lesson, in today's module. And the first is that nature sustains people. If we breathe in the air, it's rich in oxygen. Where does that oxygen come from? It comes from plants that photosynthesize and release oxygen and use carbon dioxide. We exhale carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere. Plants use that carbon dioxide to make sugars and energy for the whole of creation. So we know that nature sustains people, but there are actually papers, studies on the extent to which this happens. So this is just one of many examples that I could have selected for to illustrate this point. In this case, they're looking at what water regulation, coastal risk reduction, crop pollination, and if you go to the next slide here, you can see a list of 18 um, uh, nature enhancing processes, habitat, crop pollination, there it is, climate regulation, pest regulation, food, wood material for building, medicines, very important medicines from the rainforests. And if we go back to this slide, it shows the matrix here is quite, I think, interesting because the darker green depicts that nature has more to contribute in this particular metric, which is water quality regulation. That's, filtering water, filtering impurities out of water. And as the colors go more darker purple, that indicates that people's needs for these um, nature's contributions increase. And if we look at a map of the world, maybe not surprisingly, the places where population density is highest uh, is where people's needs for those nature contributions are highest because, that's where most people need to have drinking water, need to have clean air. Um, and the conclusion that the authors make is that well, we should just back up and say nature's contributions you can see in the low population density areas of the planet. There's a tremendous potential for nature to contribute benefits. But the um, the places where people's needs are the highest are also the place where um, oh, I think I messed up I'm gonna stop sharing here and start sharing again. I'm sorry. I hit the wrong button. Okay, so we should be in business again. Okay. I just wanted to get there we go. I wanted to have you see my face. Um, And so the place where were we? I was talking about the place where the needs for nature are greatest is also where there's the least green. And some places there's high population and green, but so this is a concern that we know nature in terms of water regulation is important, but we are diminishing nature's capacity to do that in these high human density areas. In terms of coastal reduction, in terms of crop pollination, you can sort of interpret that as well. But my point here really is just to show you that nature is important. All these metrics are important, and people study this to understand whether we're going in the right direction or whether we're not. Now, the other important part of nature is that it also helps our mental health. Um, and people have studied this. And so here is a study out of England. And Jules Pretty is a very famous agroecologist who's worked in this area for a long time. And in this study, they described green exercises as things like cycling, gardening, watering, fishing, boating, horse riding, walking, farming activities, etc. And what they discovered is that um, 5 minutes or 10 to 50 minutes or half a day or the whole day, all of them uh, in these types of activities helped with people's mental health. And it was interesting to note that even 5 minutes of exposure to some kind of a green exercise was very helpful. And in fact, it had an immediate effect, and it was maybe per unit of time most effective. And so that makes us, the fact, we're talking about agriculture here. Well, we've got, gardening and farming activities, more gardening here. So maybe being involved in some local food production where we live, which for many people is an urban setting, would be very useful, not only to improve food security, but also improve mental health opportunities. So an interesting study with, I think, some really insightful findings. Okay, so let's move on and talk about the quality of food that comes out of what we would call nature-based farming systems. Now, how are we doing on food quality? Not great. This study looked at the UK, but it also reviewed studies from Australia, United States, Finland, and others in the UK. And what they found is that the mineral content of fruit and vegetables between 1940 and 2019 have declined for many specific minerals like zinc and iron, things that are really important for brain development. And you may want to look at this paper more closely to find out what it is that caused this decline to occur. And it is um, a combination of driving for higher yield with nitrogen fertilizers, where we're having larger potatoes, larger tomatoes, but we're diluting micronutrients per gram of potato. It has to do with our plant breeding programs. It has to do with increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which also results in more carbon in the food products and less of the minerals. And but it's a concern that needs to be addressed. So, so in terms of food production, you know, number one, the quality is threatened, at least in some things. What can we do to improve it using natural systems agriculture? Okay, let me start with animal agriculture. In animal agriculture, um, we are very interested in the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And those are fatty acids. And you can explore the literature on this further if you'd like to know more about what we're exactly talking about in terms of the fatty acids. But for the purposes of our discussion, let me just say that the ratio between omega-6, which is not really very good for you, and omega-3, which is very good for your heart, uh, should be about 1. You should have 1 of each. But if we look at our grain-fed livestock production, especially ruminant livestock, our omega-6 to 3 ratio is 7, 5, 15, and even higher. And that is linked to um, heart health problems and other diseases. And so, what this data is showing is that when ruminants are fed a diet only of herbaceous material, or sometimes we call that grass-fed ruminant production, the ratio of omega-6 to 3 is much closer to um, the animal products that we as humans evolved eating out of the wild. And so here's a summary. Research spanning 3 decades supports the argument that grass-fed livestock products on a gram per gram fat basis have a more desirable fat profile, higher in conjugated linolenic acid, which is another constituent, and a better omega-6 to 3 ratio that is preferred by the nutritional community. And there's also benefits in terms of vitamins, beta carotene, and other constituents. So let's explore this a little bit further, going to another paper where they looked at enhancing the fatty acid profile of milk through a more forage-based ration or herbage. So on the right here, we've got the milk fatty acids, the 6 to 3 ratio, and the conjugated linolenic acid. You want high levels of this, and this one you want close to 1. So if we look at conventional dairy production, we're looking at omega-6 to 3 of 5.8. If we look at a diet that gets very, very few forages, we're looking at 8. And here we've got grass-fed milk where the ratio of 6 to 3 omega fatty acids is close to 1. And that's desirable. And that is why grass-fed milk has become very popular in the marketplace. It's the fastest growing class of milk in Europe because people want to feed healthy milk and cheese and cream and for their children and also as they get older. Now, organic is at 2.3, so it's better than the conventional. Why is it not closer to 1? Well, that's because the organic standards allow some grain feeding. And what we also see now is a lot of organic grass-fed. So those would be closer to the zero 0.9 or zero 0.1. So here's a summary, and you can look at this paper if you want in greater detail. Now, just one of the many medical articles on omega-6, omega-3 fatty acids. We know that a ratio of 2.5 to 1, which would be considered low, it would be considered here about what the organic was able to achieve, reduced colorectal cancer, and also reduces the risk of cancers and cardiovascular diseases. So, and chronic diseases that are multigenic. So, there's a lot of chronic diseases in our society these days. And so we know then that an ideal situation is for us to not focus on animal products that come from, animals that are fed grain, but to actually have animal products where the animals are raised on herbage, which gives us a chance to grow multi-species pastures, a much more natural land use for much of the world. And so, and as we move to that direction, we have more phytochemicals, we have a better omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. So there's all kinds of health benefits to doing this. Now, you may remember last week I introduced you to Dr. Fred Provenza, and one of the reasons he wants us to learn about animal behavior is because moving from this type of farming system, and if you follow the arrow to this type of farming system, is often really challenging. Shifting the diet from here to here could actually cause your animals to lose productivity. And so this is why Dr. Provenza is focusing on animal behavior knowledge, so that if you go from the current feeding system to the new system, that you go this way and you don't suffer what he calls the adaptive trough, because um, the animals are not properly trained to shift the diet from grain to herbage. And you can look at last week's lecture for more explanations on how to do that. Okay. So you will also remember from last lecture, we looked at this one case study from Ontario that Myra Van D did for her master's work. And this farm, and you'll remember the feeding system on this grass-fed farm, and they were producing organic grass-fed milk from this system. And that milk, we would expect it to have a much higher value in terms of human nutrition. And so it's a desirable type of farming system. Um, we are very interested in this in the world because medical interventions for chronic diseases, for coronary diseases, for cancers are very expensive. And the fact that we can use the way we produce the food as a source of medicine is not lost on those people who are figuring out how to use our scarce tax dollars to fund the accessible medical system. Now, uh, the other question that comes up when we talk about eating animal products is, well, why not eat soy-based or pea-based alternative sort of meat substitutes instead? And well, they're perfectly legitimate, and there are very good vegan diets and vegetarian diets out there. If people pay close attention to what they're eating, that's perfectly fine. In terms of um, the amino acids that humans are getting, beef, if we look at two amino acids, methionine and lysine, beef muscle meat gives higher levels than the soy or the pea, so there are advantages to that. And then in terms of greenhouse gases, if we look at a feedlot finished beef animal, it's producing more greenhouse gases than getting that protein from soybean or pea. But there are a number of studies that are now showing that a good intensive grazing system uh, with the animals on forage can actually become carbon neutral or even better. So there's some controversy among those papers. There's not that many of them yet, but there is definitely evidence to support this. Okay, so that's animal products. Let's take a look at. I'm going to give you an example here of tomatoes. Who likes tomatoes? Well, I think garden tomatoes are great for everybody because they're so fresh and juicy and great for all kinds of things. What the researchers that I'm featuring here have found is that when hairy vetch, and there it is up there, growing as a cover crop, when hairy vetch is grown as a cover crop in a tomato system, I'm just going to jump right to the conclusion here. There was a higher expression of genes within those tomato leaves. And these genes conferred more efficient utilization and mobilization of nitrogen, higher photosynthetic rates, and some plant disease defense genes. And so what the way this research started is that agronomists were working with cover crops and horticultural crops like tomato, and they noticed that when hairy vetch was in the system, the tomatoes didn't lose their leaves as quickly. They grew for a longer duration. And, the questions that I would have if I would observe that, I would think, well, maybe there's more nitrogen. So the leaves are just not running into a nitrogen deficiency. But the researchers found that it was more than that. There was actually a genetic response within the tomato that responded to the cover crop. So this example here shows that it can happen. And there are also some studies to look at tomato nutrition. But the better studies are actually, I'm just going to jump right ahead to here, are actually, here's an example of one where John Reginold looked at strawberries grown in an organic and a conventional system and found that um, the organic strawberries had more antioxidants, more phenolics than the conventional strawberries, and that was statistically significant. So that's probably it could be a similar mechanism where the genes in the strawberries are actually being affected by the hairy vetch cover crop in the organic system. So uh, this is an area that deserves far more attention. Um, and now back, I'm on to my slideshow here. When I read this literature, it reminded me of a study that we did in Nicaragua, where we were doing some on-farm research, comparing tomatoes. It was a bean maize tomato rotation. And we looked at over 6 years, we had this tomato system was composted manure, cover crops, and neem insecticide. And this tomato crop here was fertilizer, synthetic insecticides, no manure, no cover crops. And I may have explained this before, but in this particular year, there was a bad volcano and these crops were really stressed. And these ones just withstood that stress a lot better. And so I do wonder how the cover crops and the manure might have affected the genetics expression within these tomato plants versus these ones. So it's just something I'm wondering about. We didn't actually measure it in this study. But if we think about it further and we look further into the literature, one of the things that we do know is the mechanisms of the cover crops on the gene expression begin with the effect of the cover crop on changing the soil microbial community. And so that is the mechanism that I think a lot of people have uncovered, is that if you improve the soil health, you change the biology of the soil, and those biological changes in the soil will help flip genetic switches in the plant to allow them to be healthier, to produce more fungal root connections, which bring more micronutrients into the plant and that type of thing. So very exciting area of research. I told a student once that, I'm kind of getting tired of soil health. And by that I meant that I don't think soil health is a bad idea. It's a terrific idea. It's so good that we're thinking about it. But now I want to see us taking that soil health out for a test drive, see what it can do in terms of making plants more stress tolerant, making plants more nutritious for humans. So staying on this theme, I want to introduce you to Lucius Tam at FIBO in Basel, Switzerland. And he is a scientist interested in, these are pear trees, interested in how we can produce the healthiest pears from managing the soil. And so he's got this experiment going where there's different soil management and he can test how that affects the pears. But there's another side, and what he's interested in is things like the secondary plant metabolites, which I showed in a previous slide with those animals, um, and the antioxidants, micronutrients. That's what we're interested in. So what Lucius did is actually an additional experiment, sort of where he got into the genetics of it in a very interesting way. He collected soil from different long-term field studies in Europe, and where there was, organic, conventional, or, manure treated versus mineral fertilizer treated, etc. And then he grew Arabidopsis plants in those soils, and he took samples from those Arabidopsis, and he looked at how the different soil that the Arabidopsis grew in would express disease-fighting genes in the plants and also in the pears. So this is very interesting research, and you can look up Lucius's work in this area. It's quite exciting. And of course, I did talk about really the same type of thing with strawberries. And the final slide on this comes um, from the organic research world. This is a study from the British Journal of Nutrition, and the researchers looked at all kinds of secondary plant metabolites, antioxidants, vitamins in organic versus conventional foods. And the uh, results show that in most cases, if the dot is on the right-hand side of this line, that means the organic has more. And you can see the organic food products tended to be higher in these nutrition positive metrics. The one that was lower was protein, and that makes sense to me because organic systems don't have that punchy nitrogen fertilizer that urea gives you. But for certainly for Canada, we get way too much protein in our diet anyways. And the other one is cadmium here, and cadmium is a heavy metal, which is not good for people, and it's higher in conventional because it's a product of phosphorus fertilizer manufacturing. So this is the work of Carlos Leifert, who was at Newcastle University for years and then at Southern Cross University in Australia. You'll notice I still have a picture of tomatoes here, and I don't have a yellow thing here. I'm back to nature sustains people, and I wanted to make another point about this exact experiment that we were involved in Nicaragua. The farm family here was doing quite well economically by the type of production system they had. This is what they were doing. This was just a control plot that we made them put into their farming system to see how well their system was functioning. And so they were economically doing quite well, and that gave them choices, right? If they wanted to stay farming, well, if it's economical, you can do that. But if they wanted to leave farming and move to the city and do something else, get a different type of education, that's fine. People should have that free choice. The circumstances, however, in countries like Nicaragua and much of Central America, and indeed much of the world, is that the options when you leave the farm are not always very, very positive. And so a lot of times that means moving into urban slums. And that's not to say that urban slums don't have community or don't have, positive things in people's lives. Anywhere where we gather in a society, we can have a wonderful life. But it does create risks and it does limit opportunities. And so my point here is that by employing nature-based systems on the farm, it allows you to farm with fewer inputs that put you into debt and that gives you more choice in your life. So if we look at urban slums in a place like Central America, in some countries, over half of the people live in urban slums. Here's Peru and Bolivia. We look at Asia. There's a lot of countries here with very high levels of urban slums. India, it's over 50%. And so why are people in those urban slums? Maybe it's because nobody really helped them valorize maybe their own knowledge about nature-based agriculture, which would have given them more options. If I had a choice as where I could raise my children, would it be an urban slum or somewhere like a farm in Nicaragua? I would definitely choose the farm. Okay, so let's move on. Making people more nature aware. And I want to start here with this idea of moving from learner to leader. if you go to a farm meeting, and even scientific meetings, oftentimes the pioneering farmer, the first person who started doing a nature-based farming system, will actually be one of the speakers. And I think that's just wonderful. It makes it really exciting to hear from the actual practitioners. And this is not that um, unpredictable because when we look at new sustainable production systems, the producer is interacting with all these other players, the academic mentors, commodity reps, professional agronomists, neighbors. And so they're educating themselves all the time. And so this one study was done in Canada. These are all the Canadian provinces, and the participants were farmers, and they were exposed to an online course. They were also participated in different events across the country. And what the researchers found, basically their conclusion was mentors beget mentors. So if you have these so-called mentors or experts here and they're interacting with farmers, those farmers are learners and they're going to move up and they'll still be farming, but they'll also become resident experts. So, um, there is this move from learner to leader, and we see evidence of that all the time. This is important in nature-based farming because nature-based farming is so site-specific that the type of principles might be the same in Manitoba versus in Kenya or Ethiopia, but the practices could be very different. And so you need to build up those local communities to be mentoring in their context, in the places where they're working. And then if we're going to have success with this, we also have to think of youth, because how many times have we heard that, well, the young people need to be educated so they can solve this problem and they don't make the same mistakes that we made, et cetera, et cetera. Well, youth these days are feeling quite anxious about things like climate change. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Um, and I would say before I go and you know point the finger at young people to take more responsibility, I think with something that's such an existential threat to the planet like climate change, adults have to take more of a role because we are the ones that have political clout. We mostly that's where the money is and we can have greater influence than young people protesting, although both are critically, critically important. We should protest with the young people. Having said that, um, we do know that young people have climate anxiety, and what are the things that helps them cope with that? And this Canadian research from our university showed that having the young people know there's good policy in the country, like the carbon tax that we've had in Canada, young people view that as positive. And also engagement, actually get out and do something, plant trees, have a garden, get involved in food production, et cetera, et cetera. Join an environmental club. These are things that are really important. So I just wanted to make sure that we understand that we need to offer coping mechanisms. This paper drives at how do we raise that next generation to be positively climate aware and actually prepare them to take positive action to solve this. Like I said, this is an existential threat to humans on the planet. Um, so what this paper did is really broke a large group of young people, over 700 late adolescents, into two groups. After surveying them, were these groups sort of um, problem focused? That means they were not favorable to doing something about the environment, or were they meaning focused? Were they positively associated with pro-environmental behavior? And so they had these groups, and then they went and wanted to study why the young people had the attitudes that they did. And one of the big um, reasons was uh, what their mothers and fathers and friends were saying. So going back to this slide, if the young people would have positive communication with mother, father, or friends, for example, take me seriously, but try to get me to turn my perspective around and also look at the problem and the future, hopefully. Listen to me and take my feelings seriously. Give me advice about what I can do personally to help alleviate the problem. That was associated with people who took a pro-environmental, positive, meaning-focused response. And if they had negative communications, so for example, if one of their mother, father, or friend said there's no point in bothering about it because we as humans are powerless and can't do anything about climate change. Anyway, those young people, maybe not so surprisingly, will be fairly negative, and uh, they'll just say it's a problem that we can't do anything about. So um, if we dig a bit deeper in that study, we can see that gender was a significant predictor of the de-emphasizing strategy. They kept using different terms in this paper, which was a bit confusing, but this is basically negative. They're dismissing climate change. And adolescent boys were more inclined than adolescent girls in using this coping strategy. Um, and the predictor of negative communication was coming from fathers. So especially fathers who were negative telling their children, especially their sons, that was having a big gender effect. And you can see here in the de-emphasizing the threat, the negative communication by father, they actually analyzed it statistically, was much more powerful than from other sources. And so I include this here because there was a television show way back when. I guess I don't think I ever watched it. I don't think we had a TV, but it was called Father Knows Best. And I guess here we would have to challenge that. If father is positive, then that might be useful. Um, they also found out that adolescent girls were more problem focused generally. They looked at boys and girls tend to look at this differently. And so this raises the issue of how we raise the next generation of, climate solvers differently. And here's an interesting observation they made from a previous study that this was in the discussion that adolescent boys felt that more than adolescent girls felt that teachers did not take their emotions seriously concerning societal and environmental issues. And so, I don't know, I'm not an expert in this area, but maybe we just have not listened to those people who disagree with us. Maybe teachers are inclined to be climate solution positive, so they automatically connect more with one gender over the other. And and there is certainly is literature on the question of are we failing boys in schools? And there's other literature saying that, the boy crisis in education is a myth. So you may want to follow up on those if you want. But I think it's when we talk about raising the next generation to be helpful, this type of study is quite useful. And then my second last theme is Indigenous knowledge. And when it comes to Indigenous knowledge, there's uh, also very good literature on this. And remember, this is a graduate course at the university where we tend to have discussions around research that's been done in these subjects as opposed to anecdotes. And so traditional ecological knowledge um, is really important, and it's being rediscovered. And this is again Fikret Berkus here at the University of Manitoba. So this paper, and then here's a very good one by Rachel Besner Kerr, who's done a lot of work in Malawi, on feminist agroecology viewed through the lens of the Plantationocene. And her argument there is that the knowledge that women have in food security in Southern Africa around food production has really not been recognized at all. And the plantations, which are established by the colonizers and often involve men, uh, really have ignored what she calls feminist agroecology. So some very good literature on this subject that you can look at. And I know this is real life, but I just checked the text because it was something urgent that came in, but it's been resolved. So, um, so if we look at ecological knowledge, um, putting it into the concept of ecosystem knowledge, which really is quite critical, um, long-term observations is one of the four pillars of good ecosystem knowledge. And when we look at long-term observation, indigenous communities, people on the ground have been incredibly important to do that. And so this is certainly uh, a place where indigenous knowledge is important. And indigenous people are involved in other things as well. There is uh, Stephen Carpenter is an expert in this area. There's a YouTube video on a lecture, and I've given you the time when you can go to that YouTube video at 29 minutes and have him explain this better than I can. But if I think about examples of indigenous knowledge, here's a very simple example. We know that if we put mulches on soil surfaces, we will reduce the evaporative loss of water, and that will make these plants more water use efficient, and they'll produce higher yields. And here's a farmer using touching the soil to figure out how hot that soil temperature is. So our hands, if they're in tune with our internal core temperature, should be about 37.6 degrees Celsius. And if the soil is warmer, then it's hotter than that. And if it's cooler, it's obviously cooler. And many other ways of addressing water use efficiency through mulches and cover crops and things like that. These are all things that farmers have developed, and it just shows how that they understand these processes. And so here's a paper from back in 1974 on, the biophysical processes of soil drying in the field. Well, these indigenous communities, they could describe that just as well. My awareness of indigenous knowledge has come from many different places. One of them is in Malawi, where I actually had the chance to work with Rachel Besner-Kerr and her team. We were working on a curriculum for farmers, and I learned that there were at least 7 ways of describing hoeing. So taking a hoe and moving soil, either to shape a hill or to remove weeds, the farmers had all kinds of different descriptions for that. And I found that, first of all, it's a very interesting form of indigenous knowledge. And we were doing a project in Southern Africa at the same time. This picture shows what we were trying to achieve. We had farmers use conservation agriculture on a portion of their field and sort of business as usual agriculture with no intercropping and no mulch in the other part of the farm. And this is a picture from Kenya. And we wanted to describe how the soil might be improved through these practices. And so after having learned that farmers are so in tune with, knowing how the hoe interacts with the soil, we developed what we called a hoe test. And so here is work in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania that we published a few years ago. And the odds of this portion of the field, the improved portion, having a higher hoe test rating, the ease with which the hoe would enter the soil versus this part of the field was statistically significant in many cases, especially in Ethiopia and Kenya. Not so much in the very sandy soil of the Dodoma district that we were working in Tanzania. And even using just farmers smelling the soil was actually also somewhat useful, although not quite as good as the hoe test. And then if the data that we published here showed the hoe test lined up very well with microbial respiration, which is a scientific measure of using the Solvita tests to look at soil health. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the indigenous knowledge from the farmers with their hoes, striking the soil and describing the ease with which that hoe went into the soil was actually a pretty good measure of soil health. Language. I want to talk about language for a moment. Um, my point here is that indigenous languages are really important to describe nature. And the example I'm going to use is genetics. So genetics is a word that started in 1905, but indigenous languages don't use that word. They don't really have a word to describe genetics in the same way as European Western science does. And so I'm going to tell you the story that fascinated me. And it comes from British Columbia on the western province in Canada, and where the scientists, some indigenous scientists actually also looked at the DNA of grizzly bear populations. They had five different populations of grizzlies, and they were distributed around the region. And the DNA of the grizzlies coincided with specific languages, historical languages within these indigenous communities. So simply by the language that's used to describe that grizzly population versus that grizzly population would tell you something about the fact that, well, it ended up being linked to the actual genetics of the grizzly bear. And they figured that out by capturing some of the hair off the grizzly bear and subjecting that to DNA analysis. So that's described here. And this paper sort of picks up the fact that this is a paper that I mentioned before, but this is an example of rediscovering sort of language to help us do better adaptive management of ecosystems. And so another form of indigenous knowledge is simply the language. And that's why in Canada, for example, and hopefully in other countries, we're investing in maintaining those indigenous language and teaching people those languages before they're lost. And I think this is my final indigenous example, and that concerns actually water management. So this is the beaver. It's on one of our coins in Canada, and the beaver is very important for water management. You can check it out on this YouTube video. But in the 1800s, when the European demand for beaver pelts was very intense, and indigenous populations in North America were encouraged to hunt the beaver and to get money for the pelts. In the driest areas, the indigenous population refused to kill the beavers because without the beavers, there would be no water and there would be no bison, which was the buffalo were the food source or a major part of the food source. So it's a fascinating story. Um, my last example is how do we transform agronomists' thinking about natural systems agriculture? And well, some of you may be agronomists, so you're taking this course, and that's good for you. Hopefully, it's helping a little bit. I wanted to give a very specific example, and it may not resonate with you immediately, but just let me see if I can help you. So this isn't organic production. This is what's called a pesticide-free production system, where farmers would just eliminate pesticides for 1 year and then maybe get a premium for that or get an environmental payment. So in Switzerland, The system involves, not adding any pesticides for an entire crop year. In Germany, it's a bit different in France. There's some programs that appear to be directed at pre-harvest pesticide application. In Canada, at the University of Manitoba, we had a program that was something like this. It was called pesticide free if you did not add any pesticides from the time of sowing to the end of harvest. So all kinds of definitions, and I don't know if these systems are actually going to be successful. I think right now, organic is a much more recognizable brand, but maybe in the future something like this will become sort of a partial system. And we actually had a study where we tried the University of Manitoba pesticide-free production definition at all these locations, all these dots in Manitoba. This is where we are in Winnipeg, and this is about 350 kilometers away. And we studied farmers who were actually attempting to grow pesticide-free production crops. And we sent students out to monitor the pests and we did not tell the farmers what to do. They had to make the choice whether they were going to end up spraying a fungicide if they had a disease, or did they do something to allow elimination of that pesticide beforehand, like maybe intercropping. So we just sort of monitored what they were doing. And the reasons farmers were interested in pesticide-free production, or we called it PFP, was reduced input costs, their own health, environmental concerns, herbicide resistance, which meant that they thought they needed to learn how to farm without weed killers anyways because they weren't working anymore, and then marketing opportunities and the farmers had actually established a marketing co-op around pesticide-free production grains that went into beer production and other things. Um, and so I don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but Mike, this comes from one of the papers. Basically, the farmers that were successful in following through with a crop all the way to harvest, the biggest driver of their success was their attitude. And this here is an attitudinal score that is described in the papers, and the farmers that were successful with pesticide-free production had a statistically significant different attitude about farming than the farmers who were not, who tried it but ended up spraying a pesticide anyways. It wasn't the weeds, it wasn't the level of disease, it was the attitude of the farmer. And so that then begs the question, how do we change the attitude of all farmers to, if we can say that pesticide-free production is a more nature-positive farming system, how do we change the attitude of agronomists to support these kind of systems? That's really all I wanted to share in this last slide. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the lecture today. I did have a few slides that I'm going to go back to and just run through very quickly. Um, and because I do think we have time, I wanted to, um, while we were talking about indigenous knowledge, I just wanted to give a couple of examples where I thought observation by people involved in the sector, I would call that a form of indigenous knowledge, could be really, really helpful. This shows the collapse of the Atlantic cod in Canada, and under the blue bar is the capture of the cod out of the eastern part of this country. The population of cod collapsed in the early 1990s, and there was tremendous overfishing, and but it just collapsed, and it was one of those classic ecological flips. The point I really want to make is that the inshore fishermen, the people not on the big trawlers who were taking most of the fish, and people, came from all over the world to fish the Grand Banks. They were ringing the alarm bells way before 1992, but they were not being listened to. So that was really a form of indigenous knowledge that, was important. And if we had listened to those fishermen, we wouldn't have had the collapse. And you can see the fish have not come back. The system has ecologically flipped. We don't know if it'll ever come back. It has not come back yet. The other observation is uh, on songbirds right here in the prairies of Canada. We've seen a tremendous decline in what we call aerial insectivores, birds that eat insects in the grassland ecosystem. And we've seen that tremendous decline. This is because we've seen a diversity of we've seen a decline in the diversity of insects because of monoculture and a lot of insecticide use. And these are also observations that ordinary citizens were making through things like bird surveys. I would also call this indigenous knowledge. And here we have another example. This is from the island of Madagascar, which is here off the coast of Africa. This is soil bleeding into the ocean. This is from a satellite image. But local farmers knew this. Local people were watching this happen because of deforestation and other things. And so, again, we didn't need a satellite to tell us how bad it was. The indigenous community would already tell us. And when it comes to land use and the points I was making about agroecology as a political movement, this is flying over Honduras and the nice flatlands here. That is all in plantations, coffee, banana, uh, date palm, and the local populations are farming these hills. That's all they get. And so this is something that people observe. They observe that the big international fruit companies and coffee companies get all the good land and they're stuck with the poor land. So I just wanted to share this as some additional sort of indigenous insights into problems and also insights that could lead to more nature-based solutions. Okay, so that takes us to the end of the lecture. Um, and I want to just let uh, those students taking the course in 2025 winter term know that on April 17th, we're going to be having our online discussion with questions or comments about the course. Otherwise, I'd like to thank you for participating in this course. Um, we've had participants from at least two different continents, maybe more when I tally everybody up. This is the first time that we've taught this course as a certificate level um, in online using YouTube platform. But thanks for joining us. I wish you all the best in your future. And now I'm going to sign off and say goodbye.